Welcome to this video, question and answer on the divine will. In this video, we'll address some very interesting questions regarding whether we can receive the gift before we even know about Luisa Piccarreta. That's the gift of the divine will. And questions regarding sin in the divine will, and questions about the Rosary, about the fourth degree, about human acts versus divine acts, and questions about whether anyone has lived in the fourth degree of the divine will since Luisa Piccarreta. Let us begin in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So I have two questions that are very much related. And the first question goes something like this: how can I live in the divine will when my responsibilities are such that my time is consumed entirely during the day? And the second question that's related is, how do I know that my acts are acts being done in the divine will? So, to get a better understanding of this, I'd like to take a look at acts by the human will. And usually we're talking about divine acts that are created with the shared divine will of Jesus. But to get a better understanding of this, we're going to categorize these human acts in three simple categories for the sake of discussion. So the first category is going to be the most extreme example. These will be acts that are sinful acts, acts where we reject God and we reject His will, and we do that willfully and with knowledge. The second category are acts where we have an inordinate attachment, and you can think of that as acts that are disordered. In other words, object of the acts is not to please God, it is not to do God's will, but it's to do our own will, and these are acts that make us very much attached to the things of the world and not to God. And then the third category are acts that are consistent with God's will for us. And these acts would be any acts that we perform as completing the normal responsibilities of our vocation. And an example of a vocation would be being a father, being a grandparent, being a daughter, being a friend, being an employee. And these are all acts that are being performed consistent with God's will, because if in doing these acts you're doing what God has willed for you to do, your vocation. And many times people think of vocation as a religious vocation, but vocations also consist of our roles in the family and in society itself. Now, as we progress through the degrees, or as we progress through the divine will, the first two categories are acts which hold us back, obviously, from advancing in the divine will. And the first one's very obvious, which was sinful acts willfully committed. And the second, the inordinate acts, are attachments that are very common in society these days. And they may be even more common than they were previously, in other words, in previous generations. These acts often have to do with the consumption of our time and the occupation of our mind and our will and our intellect and our memory, in other words, the faculties of the soul, with things such as television, social media, music, and you can see that in society. We're actually very inflicted by these type of acts. Now, there is some teaching that I've encountered that says that you can perform in the divine will, you can perform these inordinate acts because you're performing them in the divine will. And therefore they're divine acts if you do it sharing God's divine will. And that's not correct. And the reason why that is not correct is it is contrary to God's will for you to form attachments such as those. And as you advance in the divine will, those type of attachments will dissipate. Sin, as you go from the second, third, and fourth degree, will all but disappear. Actually, there's another question about that, but I'm going to save that for later. So the main point here that I'd like to make is that the acts that we perform that are consistent with God's will are those acts that can be divine acts when we share God's divine will. And the ones that are acts that are related to inordinate or disordered attachments, they're not divine acts. And even if we perform them with the intention of doing them in God's divine will, they are not divine acts because they're contrary to God's will for us. In other words, He doesn't want us occupied watching 8 hours of football on the weekend. He doesn't want us occupied watching, let's say, 4 hours of reality TV every day. He doesn't want us turning on music every chance that we have. Those are disordered and inordinate attachments. What we see all the time is social media. People constantly going on social media platforms such as Facebook and Twitter. They'll spend hours on Facebook and Twitter, and that's also an attachment. Intellectual interests can also be attachments. Politics is another one. We see that a lot. People become obsessed with politics. We have to be very careful with where we spend our time and where we place our interest. And as we progress through the divine will, and I'll utilize the degrees, in the second degree, you'll have these attachments, these disordered attachments. You'll have sin in the second degree. As you go into the third degree, and you advance, let's say you advance through the third degree, towards the end of it, you'll hardly have any of these disordered attachments. Sin will be very, very infrequent. And as Jesus says to Luisa, we must spend some time in these 2 degrees, the second and the third. They're purgative degrees. They are degrees that both purge and enlighten the soul at the same time. I'd like to do a reading, and this is Jesus speaking to Luisa. It's from Volume 16, January 4th, 1924. It is my will that tests you, and wants not only to purge you, but to destroy even the shadow of your will. What is this purgation all about? It's about eliminating these attachments that I mentioned, the inordinate attachments, and of course sin. And one of the teachings Jesus gave to Luisa also gives us insight into this. When I first read it, I was a bit shocked because it was contrary to what I was thinking. But Jesus tells Luisa that few people will enter into the fourth degree. The reason being is that he tells Luisa that they will always hold on to something of their human will. And what's meant by that are these inordinate attachments. There will always be an attachment to this world that will prevent them from going into the fourth degree. But nevertheless, Jesus still wants us to go to the fourth degree. And so do I. I share Jesus' desire for everyone to go into the fourth degree and to do their best to get there. One of the important ways to make that happen is to make sure that everyone understands what they need to do in order to get there. I'd like to move on to the next question. The next question is very related to what we just discussed. The related topic is understanding the divine will as a gift. It is a gift because, as we discussed in the video, the immensity of the divine will, this is a gift that is so immense we can never earn it. So the fact that Jesus wants us to do certain things to cooperate with his will does not mean that we are earning it. But what it does mean is that we're providing our assent and we're providing our fiat. Although Jesus can provide the gift, he is not doing it contrary to our will. In other words, he's not imposing the divine will on anyone. If you think about what we just discussed, if you're watching television for 6 hours a day and you want to live in the divine will, well, Jesus wants to give you that gift, but it's you that must put the remote control down, and you're the one that must turn the TV off. He's not going to do that for you. He'll give you all the graces and help you need, but it's you in the end that must actually provide your fiat. And there's many opportunities during the course of your life to provide these fiats. You'll have situations like I just discussed where you're being challenged by your own human will. You must put it aside, and that's a fiat. You'll be tested by Jesus. Jesus will put you in a test to test your resolve to live in the divine will, to basically point you towards growing in the divine will. And that also will involve a fiat on your part. So let's look at the question regarding what we must do. And there's some erroneous teaching out there that basically says that we don't have to do anything. And we touched upon that in one of our videos, the 6 misunderstandings, or the 6 most common understandings of the divine will. And number 4 was quietism. And the definition of that, as a reminder, it's the denial of the necessity of human activity in contemplation and sanctification. It's an assertion that the highest spirituality is attained when the mind and the will are completely inactive. I've heard this on a number of occasions via comments and questions, and they go something like this: all we need to do is ask for it. We don't even need to read. And another variation is all we need to do is ask for it and read and do the prayers, and we don't need to address anything else regarding how we live and in other words, we don't need to dispose ourselves in any way. Another one is even more extreme, is we don't have to do anything because it's a gift and God's going to give it to us. I want to read this passage, and it's from volume 26, August 3rd, 1929. This is Jesus disagreeing with all those assertions I just mentioned. And it's very clear. So please listen carefully if you're one that believes that. We do not give our goods, our graces, nor do we tell our truths to one who is not disposed, to one who does not pay attention to listen to us in order to learn our sublime lessons and model her life according to our teachings. It's very clear. Now I get some comments back on this topic where Jesus says to Luisa, let me do. He says that often, let me do, let me do. That's true. That's true, he does say that, but he says it in a certain context. And you have to understand that in context. It does not mean that you do nothing. It does not mean that you adopt this quietism. What he's asking us to do in order to live in a divine will and receive his goods and graces is to dispose ourselves and to model our lives according to his teachings. Now, the other question regarding reading. Reading is important. Luisa sacrificed a great deal in order to write these volumes for the Book of Heaven and the other works also. And Jesus did not ask her to do that for no reason. These are great teachings for us. It would behoove us to read. Besides reading, to really understand and to receive the gifts and the knowledge that Jesus is discussing in this one clear passage, we need to dispose ourselves and practice living in the divine will. Now the next question is about sin in the fourth degree, and we were just talking about the degrees. So the question is, how can you say that there's no sin in the fourth degree? And it's kind of humorous because I received the opposite question, which is, why do you say you need to go to confession? If you're in the fourth degree, you have no need for confession because there's no sin. I believe I answered that one actually in the first video that we did, the 4 degrees of the divine will. But the first question is, how can you say there's no sin in the fourth degree? Pretty much for the same reason that when I mentioned a divine act cannot be a divine act that's a sinful act, cannot be a divine act that is an inordinate attachment, an act, in other words, where you have an obsession with something. The reason being is because they're contrary. They're mutually exclusive. An act cannot be divine and sinful. And inordinate acts are acts that are outside God's will for us. So they're not divine acts. When you're in the fourth degree, you're in a degree of holiness, and you're in a degree of God's divine will where you will not commit sin. It's very unlikely that you will commit sin. Now, is it possible? I said very unlikely. I did not say impossible. So it is possible to commit sin because you still have your human will, and you can still exercise that human will. And if you did, the fall would be great. So we cannot exclude the possibility. And you could look at examples. There's Adam, and some would argue that Adam was not in the fourth degree. Some would say he is, and I'm not going to address that here, but you can look beyond Adam, look at the angels. The angels were also tested, just like Adam was. We had angels that failed the test because the sin of pride, and they would not serve, they would not obey, and their fall was great. And so would a fall out of the fourth degree. So going back to the original question, why can't someone in the fourth degree sin? So they can sin. However, they would lose their place in the fourth degree, just like Adam and the angels, the fallen angels, lost their place. In other words, if someone were in the fourth degree and sinned, they would no longer be in the fourth degree. To go a little further on that, and we talked about the need for the fiat, the ascent. The same is true in the situations that we live in now, where we were born in sin and we endeavor to advance in the divine will, and we're lucky enough, if we are lucky enough, to get into the fourth degree. Then you can understand that this process that we went through, the purgation that I mentioned in the second and the third degree, you can see that it's no plan B for God that we are going through this process and going into the fourth degree in this manner. In other words, this was always plan A for God. You can understand that by understanding how Adam fell. Adam did not go through this purgation. He did not have to live in the second and third degree. He was created with the divine will. He did not have to dispose himself. He was not tested. He was born with the divine will. And when he was tested, he failed. You can see how the current fiat, the third fiat, is really plan A for God, because you can understand this is the best way to get into the fourth degree, not to be created with it. It is almost as if God's justice and his mercy required that Adam was created with the divine will, and that he was tested, and he failed the test. And it's no surprise to God that Adam failed the test. God always knew that Adam would fail it. As we discuss in the divine will regarding the acts, the past, present, and future, are known to God, and they're one act. So God was well aware that Adam would fail. It is almost as if his justice said, we're going to create him perfectly, and we're going to show that the creature cannot maintain the divine will without ever being tested, without using his human will in order to dispose himself. And Pope Francis often likes to say that God is a God of surprises, but God is a God also that is never surprised himself. And I did see the term one time in the Book of Heaven where Jesus says that he was surprised by the God's ability to create in the small human soul such a large and immense gift such as the divine will. But it was in the context of being more like astonishment and not surprising that God didn't know that that could be done. So another question is regarding, again, the fourth degree. The question is, has there been anyone since Luisa Piccarreta who has lived in the fourth degree? I think we pointed out previously on this channel that yes, most definitely. Saint Annabelle de Francia was one. And Jesus mentions that Saint Annabelle de Francia is an apostle, the first apostle of the divine will. Also that he would have the first place because of his actions in supporting Luisa and her writings. So as an apostle, does the apostle not receive the gift in order to distribute it to others? Just like the apostles, did the apostles in the time of redemption, did they not receive the Holy Spirit? Of course they did. Also, there's other people that live in the fourth degree. I can tell by some of the things that they have said. And I would say that in these days, there are more people that live in the fourth degree than ever did live in the fourth degree. And it's appropriate for these times. Another question, and these questions are somewhat related. I see like a common theme in these questions. And the question is whether everyone is called. It was placed to me by a comment, more of a comment, not everyone is called. I disagree with that totally. The reason why I disagree with it is that Jesus tells Luisa that there will be a day when everyone will live in the divine will. For that to happen, everyone must be called. Now, there's a couple factors that we just discussed that may prevent people from living in the divine will. And I was referring to advancing in the divine will. But I've also encountered people who've attempted to live in the divine will. They seem to have been provided poor guidance. They both said something very similar. They said that they did what they were told to do for the divine will, which was say the prayers, do the rounds, prevenient act. I think they did some reading also, but then the expectation was that after describing how wonderful the divine will is and Luisa's life and what a great saint she was, their opinion of it was, well, I did what I was asked to do and nothing happened. There has to be some patience, as we go through this. There's also needs to be some guidance. And I said before in a previous video, the divine will has to change your life. Now, you could already be a holy person. If you're given the divine will, you're going to be more holy. If you're a person who's coming out of the first degree and maybe you're even sinful, that's going to help you a lot, and it's going to change your life. As a matter of fact, I'll bring up one of the testimonies I've heard before. This person became involved with the divine will because of not testimony, not anyone trying to tell them about the divine will, but by an example, by a living example of someone who started living in the divine will. And he said, I became involved in the divine will because I wanted to know what changed that man. And that person was changed for the better to such a point that it was obvious. And it's such a large change. This person was attracted to the divine will because of that change. That type of change needs to be reflected in our lives also if we are living in the divine will. I want to go to the next question, and this one's going to be a brief answer. I've been told, and this is kind of shocking to me, I've been told by a number of viewers that they were told that they should not pray the Rosary. A couple things about this is, one, I assume that people have seen pictures of Luisa with rosaries in her hand. She's not advocating against the Rosary. We all know she lived in the divine will, and she prays the Rosary. Second, God is not wasting our Blessed Mother's time sending her to us, to people who don't listen to her, pleading with us to pray the Rosary. And third but not least, Jesus actually tells Luisa, I'll read you this. It's a passage of volume 25, October 7th, 1928. So will the sweet and powerful beads of her rosary make her victorious and triumphant again before the divinity, conquering the kingdom of the divine fiat to make it come into the midst of creatures. So not only should you pray the Rosary, and you should pray it in the divine will, but it is an important prayer, a very important prayer. If there's anyone telling you you do not need to pray the Rosary or advising against it, and these people were saying they were being told not to pray the Rosary, but to do the rounds and the prevenient acts, anyone telling you that, stop listening to them, because this is something that is so basic that they're going to get a lot more wrong, and tell you very wrong things about the divine will and probably about other things as well. So what I recommend you do is listen to Father Iannuzzi. Father Iannuzzi is a theologian, and I believe that he's sent to us in these times to help guide us. Now, I haven't read everything he wrote, and I haven't listened to everything that he's created, but I've listened to plenty. In my humble opinion, he's never taken a wrong step when it comes to the divine will. Now, does that mean that he's infallible? No. Does that mean that the same gift he has concerning the divine will translates into other areas? No, it doesn't. But in the divine will, I can attest, based upon my limited knowledge, is from what I know, he's never made a mistake in it. Basically, the questions that I've been answering have all been due to teachings that are done by people who really have the best interest in mind, but they don't have the background of someone like Father Iannuzzi, so they're going to make mistakes. They're doing their best, and they're well-meaning, but if you want true guidance, then I would recommend listening to him, Father Iannuzzi, because some of the questions and comments, they're so common that I think that they're coming from teaching that's not correct. And some of the incorrect teaching, even though these are by people who really want the best for us, they are somewhat insidious. So like the idea that you can have inordinate attachments, disordered attachments, and do those in the divine will and not worry about it because your intent is to do the divine will, that's very insidious. That's going to hold you back. So the next one I have is a very interesting one. And it's a question. Can you receive the gift of the divine will before you, and I might have, in one of my videos, I think that I might have prompted this question because I mentioned that you might be even prepared in the divine will before you even know about Luisa Piccarreta. So the question is, can you receive the gift before you know about Luisa Piccarreta or the divine will? And the answer is yes, because you can be properly disposed in order to do that. So if you're properly disposed and your intent is to do God's divine will, because you don't know about the gift, and you don't know about the teachings that were provided to Luisa, it is possible, because it is a gift, that you could receive it. Now, you'll be somewhat handicapped in the sense that you don't understand it, but you could receive it, and you could receive some of the gift. There's different ways of living in the divine will, and I mention the degrees all the time because there's most people will live in the second degree, and less people will live in the third, and less people will live in the fourth. But living in the divine will, whether it's a second degree only, is really a great thing. I mentioned in one of the videos that if everyone lived in a second degree in the whole world, this world would be a paradise. So you can definitely receive the gift. I think in many cases prepared to live in the divine will before you actually know about Luisa and her teachings. And the reason being, very similar to what we just talked about, is there's no surprises for God, right? God knows who's going to live in his holy divine will. I'll read this one passage from volume 36, May 6, 1938. The kingdom of our will is already established. We know its numbers. We know them all by name. So God can definitely prepare you to live in the divine will, and he can also provide the gift as well. Now, more than likely, receiving the gift is going to be accomplished by 3 different ways. One is you could receive it directly from Jesus. You could also receive it through the intercession of our Blessed Mother. And, it might be surprising, but you can also receive it from the intervention of people who live in the divine will. Because Jesus, as he often tells Luisa, loves to work through his creatures that live in the divine will. That being said, I'd like to go back to the beginning of the question and answer period and recommend that everyone do what they can to advance in the divine will. We want everyone to live in the 4th degree of the divine will and receive the great gifts that are part of living there, so that you can say, like Saint Elizabeth of the Trinity, a Carmelite saint, it does not matter if I live or die, because I am living heaven on earth. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe to help us promote this content, and God bless.